Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to the Norushen encounter 10-man heroic in the Siege of Orgrimmar.
Hello.
Now this fight on heroic is a lot more difficult than it was on normal.
Yes, it's a lot more like tight on the enraged time and everything. You've got to kind of do everything to perfection, so you need to know your stuff.
It's all about managing your corruption.
Yeah. Now if you haven't seen our normal mode guide to this fight, then please do click up on the screen now in the annotation and that'll take you straight over to our normal mode guide, because we're not going to be explaining how the boss works on like a normal mode level. You should kind of already know that if you want to do it on heroic, so do check out that guide if you don't know what the mechanics are on normal.
Now for this encounter you want to bring 2 tanks, 3 healers and a mixture of DPS. The DPS doesn't really matter, you can bring whatever you want. Now this encounter really, the boss has gained no new abilities, everything just hurts a little bit more, and the way that the corruption works is slightly different to how it was before. But before we talk about like how the corruption works now, we're just going to give you like a really quick overview of all his normal abilities, just so you know exactly what they all are. The boss will still do his Unleashed Anger and Self-Doubt, which is the big tank hit with a debuff. Yeah. Just make sure you taunt when it drops off you. He'll still do his Blind Hatred, which is the spinny beam that will either go clockwise or counterclockwise. Just avoid it, really simple. He still has his Icy Fear effect on himself, which just increases the amount of AoE damage he does over time. The lower his health is, the more damage he'll do. And you'll still have to deal with the Look Within mechanic, which we'll go into more detail in a moment, which will allow you to enter the other realm by clicking on these golden orbs. And one thing to keep in mind, on heroic there are far more golden orbs, but really you don't need to use them all.
Now the main difference in this fight is really from the adds that spawn. You still have the Manifestation of Corruption, which we're going to call the big ad, and the Essence of Corruption, which is the little ad. Now the big ad still does his pulsing AoE, but the thing is, on heroic, this now gives you 5 corruption per pulse it does. So it's extremely important, 1, that he dies quick, and 2, that you are aware that of course you're going to be taking corruptions from other sources now instead of where you'd normally get it, so just be careful about that.
Now when the ad does die, the orb that he drops, every time this pulses and does damage on the raid, it will also apply 5 corruption, and it will immediately pulse when it drops. So every time an ad dies, not only will it do 5 corruption to the raid from just its normal pulsing AoE, you'll also gain another 5 when the orb drops, and the orb still gives you the standard 25 corruption. Now you want your tanks and your healers only to pick up this orb, and the reason for this is, like we said at the start of this video, the enrage time on the boss is very small. It's actually 7 minutes, and the DPS requirement to do that, I mean, it isn't actually high in terms of the actual numbers, but because of this corruption, like lowering your DPS, because obviously the higher your corruption is, the less damage you deal to the boss, makes it a very tight enrage timer.
Now the little ads, just like on normal mode, they'll just keep spam casting into the boss, those bolts. If any of these bolts hit the boss, they'll now give him an 8% damage increase for 20 seconds instead of 5% for 15 seconds. So never let any of these go through. You should always be interrupting all of these, and on normal mode you should be intercepting these, not on heroic. Each time you do intercept one of these bolts, you will be taking 5 corruption as well as the damage, so your corruption is certainly going to start getting high.
Yeah, you should only ever intercept them if you're a tank or a healer.
Yeah.
But generally you shouldn't need to intercept these. These small lads should die way before like anything else dies. They've got very little health. So that is all the changes on this encounter. It's literally all about your corruption. So in order for you to defeat this encounter, you need to set up some sort of rotation of people going inside and people absorbing the orbs from the big ads outside. And one thing to note, on heroic, you do start with 50 corruption rather than 75 corruption, which does help a little bit. Now, although you could actually send 2 DPS in every single time to drop their corruption, that actually has a negative effect in the raid, because every time one of the DPS does finish one of their Look Within phases, one of the big ads will spawn, and this is the same as normal as well. These big ads will spawn every time a DPS is finished. Having 2 of these big ads up at the exact same time is really dangerous, because you don't want too many of the AoE pulses to go off at the same time, because everyone will get corruption and it will just mess everything up. We always send a rotation of a DPS and a healer, and then the next time people go in, a DPS and a tank, then a DPS and a healer, then a DPS and a tank, and we just follow that all the way through until lower percentages in the fight, and we'll explain why in a moment.
Now when the DPS actually does exit, you might be thinking, well, they're just going to get the corruption straight back again, what's the point of even sending them in? The thing is, you'll get a purified buff on you that lasts a minute and a half, and this will make it so that you'll continue doing damage as if you had 0 corruption until either you reach 100 corruption or the debuff runs out. So like, it isn't that bad. So when you do send a DPS in, they'll be doing their full amount of damage as they normally would be doing for at least a minute and a half, or of course until they get a stupid amount of corruption for doing something wrong. So you should still be sending DPS in there. Don't just try and zerg the boss, for Christ's sake.
As for when the tank and the healers actually need to go inside the room, you'd only ever go inside the room when you have so much corruption that you can't absorb one of the orbs that's on the ground, unless you know it's safe for you to stay out and just keep healing. This means that pretty much you'll only ever have one tank outside. Like, you'll very rarely have two tanks out at the same time. As soon as one of the other tanks comes out, the other one should really go back in. And it's the same with healers. You'll only ever really have two healers outside, and you always have a healer inside. You always need to develop some sort of rotation, and you need to communicate with each other throughout the encounter, and you can let each other know how much corruption you have and who is the best person to go inside. And the best person to go inside is whoever has the highest amount of corruption. One thing to note though, with you guys can go in as much as you possibly want, because when you do finish inside there, you don't spawn any ads. It's only the DPS that'll ever spawn the ads. Now, one thing to keep in mind, when you reach around 50%, the boss will start spawning a big ad every 10%, which means that if you have DPS also going inside, you could potentially have two ads spawn at the exact same time. Now, if this is the case, you really need to switch them very, very quickly. And the best way of also maximizing DPS on this is that the DPS inside, you should always kill the 4 small ads in there first, and then kill the big ad last, because as soon as the big ad dies in there, he'll immediately go outside. So you can be like inside still killing the 4 little ads with your big ad outside doing damage to the raid and being a pain in the ass, rather than you being out there doing damage to it as well. So always kill that big guy last when you're inside there, so you can deal damage to it when you get out. Now, because the nature of ad spawning every 10% after this 50% mark, DPS will get to 100% corruption. No doubt, some DPS will, and there's not really anything you can do about this. It's just a huge pain. One thing to note, if you do have 100% corruption, that means you're doing less damage to the boss, but not to the ads. So really, if you do have 100% corruption, you can kind of split your DPS, especially if you're getting tight to the enrage and say, look, people who haven't got 100%, you do damage to the boss, everyone else do damage to the ads, and try and balance it out. Otherwise, just always just go on the ad, just as a safety precaution. Around the 20% or 15% mark on the boss, this should be about like a minute and a half until enrage. There is no point in sending any more DPS in, because you're just going to do more harm than good. Because when you do go in and you finish up, you might come out with your like full damage buff up, but you've just spawned a new big ad, and at this point people are going to have high corruption because ads keep spawning. So really around the 15 to 10% mark, DPS should no longer go inside, and really neither should tanks or healers, because the amount of damage that's going on the raid at this point is at its highest because of the boss's Icy Fear buff. The lower the boss's health is, the more AoE damage he's doing to the raid. So around this low percentage mark, tanks and healers need to speak to each other and say, look, I have this much corruption so I can absorb 1 orb or 2 orbs or whatever. You need to let each other know. And one thing to note, obviously when you are picking these up, you do need at least room for 30 corruption, because the orb will always do 1 pulse before you actually pick it up.
So overall, this fight is really just about maintaining your like low levels of corruption. You just got to manage your corruption properly, because if you let your corruption get out of control, DPS are going to start getting ridiculously high corruption, which you really don't want, or people are just going to start dying because they're not being able to pick up the orbs at all. So it is really managing your corruption, because the boss does have such a tight enrage timer. So as long as you can really beat that enrage timer, you shouldn't have too many issues.
You just need to communicate when the big ad dies, and you need to say beforehand who can pick up the orb and who is going to pick up the orb. And after a few pulls, you should be able to develop some sort of rotation that should never change throughout the fight. Once you've got the rotation set, you should be fine for the rest of the encounter.
So thank you for watching, guys. If this guide helped you out, then please do give us a like, it helps us out a lot, and make sure to comment, rate and subscribe.
And if you'd like to see other 10-man heroic guides by FatBoss, please do click up on the annotations you see on your screen now, and that'll take you straight to that video. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.